The NASA space missions have led to the tragic death of many astronauts and have been the center of extreme debate. But there are deeper, more secretive reasons we've never gone back to the moon. Things the astronauts saw that until recently have remained classified and away from the public eye.
Sir, we're not alone.
Number 16. The hidden challenges of Apollo 11. The mission faced serious challenges, but it was a huge success. The Apollo 11 mission, an impressive accomplishment, had its own set of challenges and dangers.
Hey, John, this is perfect with the LIM and the rover and you and Stone Mountain.
While Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were flying the lunar module, they almost ran into a big problem. After their famous moonwalk, as they were getting ready to return to the command module, they discovered a major issue. The circuit breaker for the ascent engine was not working. This switch was essential for starting the engine that would lift the lunar module back into orbit. Unfortunately, the switch had been accidentally broken off, leaving the circuit breaker in an open position. This meant the engine couldn't start when it was time to return to the command module, which was orbiting the moon. To fix the problem, Aldrin used a felt-tip pen to push the circuit breaker switch back into place. This quick-thinking solution made sure that the circuit was properly closed and the ascent engine was ready to fire when needed. With the problem solved, the engine fired successfully, allowing them to leave the moon's surface and return safely. Even after their long journey of 195 hours, 18 minutes, and 35 seconds, the Apollo 11 crew still faced significant challenges.
An effort that they trained for. He says they knew what to do. Then a different frogman carefully approached the hatch.
When they finally landed in the Pacific Ocean for recovery, things didn't go as planned. Bad weather caused them to land 13 miles away from the recovery ship, USS Hornet. This close call almost led to disaster, but luckily, the astronauts were unharmed. The Apollo 11 astronauts' ability to stay calm and think clearly under pressure showed their incredible bravery and creativity. Despite the dangers they faced, they managed to lead their mission to success. Number 15. The financial and human cost of Apollo 11. Recently, there's been a lot of buzz about going back to the moon. The Apollo program is one of humanity's greatest achievements. But after its end in 1972, NASA never returned to the moon. In the US, there's a big push to make space travel more affordable. First, the Apollo missions were extremely costly, and the US government, dealing with budget issues, wasn't willing to spend that much on more moon trips. Developing new technology and spacecraft for future lunar missions would have been very expensive. Looking back, NASA's budget for the Apollo program, which ran from 1960 to 1973, was $56.6 billion. This amount covered all the work done, even after the last Apollo mission. Of this total, $19.4 billion was specifically for the Apollo missions. However, the actual cost of the Apollo program, including various extra expenses and funding from other sources, was around $20.4 billion. When adjusted for inflation to $2008, NASA's entire budget from 1960 to 1973 was about $363 billion. Work on Apollo started in 1959, and the final mission took place in 1972. The budget figures for 1960 to 1973 reflect the costs specific to the Apollo program during those years. From 1959 to 1972, the U.S. federal spending totaled $1.9 trillion. Adjusting this for inflation to $2008, the total becomes $11.9 trillion. NASA's budget during this time was about 2.2% of the total federal spending. The Apollo program's budget was about 50% of NASA's budget, or roughly 1.1% of the total federal spending during those years. In 2005, NASA estimated that returning to the moon would cost around $104 billion over 13 years. There has been a lot of debate about this estimate, and NASA has already spent about $7.7 billion on the project. As of 2020, NASA's goal is to return to the moon by 2024 through the Artemis program. The country spent over 8 years and $2.4 billion on the Apollo 11 mission. Adjusting for inflation, that's more than $23 billion today. Secondly, after the initial excitement of the Apollo 11 moon landing, public interest in exploring the moon faded. Many people saw the moon landings more as a political victory than a scientific breakthrough, which reduced the pressure on NASA to keep going with lunar missions. NASA then shifted its focus to other projects. They started working on the Space Shuttle program and exploring low Earth orbit. Reusable spacecraft were more cost-effective than sending missions to the moon. Investments in projects like the Hubble Space Telescope and the International Space Station also took priority. Political factors played a big role, too. The Apollo program was driven largely by the Cold War competition between the US and the Soviet Union. Once the goal of landing humans on the moon and showing technological superiority was achieved, the drive to continue lunar exploration lessened. Though the Apollo missions provided valuable scientific data, some questioned the long-term benefits of further moon missions. NASA had already gathered a lot of samples and information, and some scientists felt additional missions might not yield much more. The Apollo missions also faced risks, such as the close call with Apollo 13. Even though technology could improve safety, human spaceflight always carries risks. Concerns about safety and potential political fallout from accidents were significant. Today, the challenges of high costs, safety issues, and the scientific value of lunar exploration still exist. However, there are renewed efforts to return humans to the moon, marking the start of a new chapter in lunar exploration, even though it comes with its own set of complex challenges. Number 14. Political motivations. Why the moon? During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union, two major world powers with opposing political systems, competed fiercely in space. Both nations wanted to outdo each other by achieving the best technology and reaching milestones in space first. As World War II was ending, the Americans and Soviets captured Germany's advanced rocket technology, including the V-2 rockets. One key figure for the Americans was Wernher von Braun, a German rocket engineer who would lead the U.S. space program. The Soviets recruited Sergei Korolev, a Ukrainian engineer, to head their space efforts. In 1955, both countries announced plans to launch satellites into space. The Soviets led the way by successfully putting the first satellite, Sputnik 1, into orbit on October 4, 1957. The Americans followed, launching their first satellite, Explorer 1, 4 months later. The Soviets continued to lead with another historic achievement. On April 12, 1961, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first person to orbit Earth aboard Vostok 1. Gagarin returned to Earth as a hero in the Soviet Union and an international celebrity. The U.S. caught up when astronaut Alan Shepard became the first American in space aboard Freedom 7 just 3 weeks later. Feeling the pressure of being behind, President John F. Kennedy announced on May 25, 1961, that America would land a man on the moon before the decade was over. This goal led to the creation of the Apollo program. Meanwhile, in February 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit Earth. On June 16, 1963, Soviet cosmonaut Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman in space. NASA's budget increased to meet the challenge of landing on the moon. Alongside Apollo, NASA launched the Gemini program to develop the necessary technology. Gemini saw Ed White become the first American to walk in space, though Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov had achieved a spacewalk earlier. Gemini also marked the first docking of 2 spacecraft in Earth's orbit. After many tests and preparations, Apollo 11 was launched on July 16, 1969, with astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. The mission faced problems, including malfunctions that forced a manual landing of the lunar module, named the Eagle. On July 20, 1969, Armstrong stepped onto the moon, becoming the first human to walk on its surface. He famously said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." With this achievement, and with the Soviets' lunar landing attempts failing between 1969 and 1972, America won the space race. Interest in lunar missions waned afterward. By the 1970s, U.S.-Soviet relations improved, and in 1975, the Apollo-Soyuz mission took place. This historic flight saw American and Soviet spacecraft dock in orbit, symbolizing a thaw in Cold War tensions. Number 13. the Soviet Union's secret moon program. In the 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a fierce competition to reach the moon. President Kennedy made it clear in his famous 1961 speech that America aimed to land on the moon. Meanwhile, the Soviets kept their lunar ambitions a secret for many years. It wasn't until 1989 that they finally admitted to their moon plans. Even though the Soviets publicly denied their lunar goals, they were actively working on their space program, which continued even after the United States Apollo 11 mission successfully landed on the moon in 1969. The Soviets chose to keep their efforts hidden to avoid admitting defeat in the space race. Instead of focusing on landing humans on the moon, the USSR concentrated on robotic missions and unmanned spacecraft through their Luna program. The Luna missions had various goals, like orbiting the moon, achieving soft landings, and collecting samples. However, the Luna program faced many problems, such as technical failures, issues with their launch vehicles, and limited funding. One major setback was the crash landing of the Luna 50 spacecraft, which happened just before the Apollo 11 mission. In the end, the United States won the race to the moon and claimed victory in this historic competition. Number 12. The astronauts' lack of insurance. In July 1969, the world watched in wonder as 3 brave astronauts set off on a journey to the moon aboard the Apollo 11 spacecraft. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins were on a historic mission that would change human history forever. However, what many people don't realize is that these daring explorers didn't have life insurance for their risky trip into space. Choosing not to get life insurance was a tough decision. Insurance companies thought the mission was too dangerous and refused to offer coverage, noting the unique challenges and potential risks of space travel. The astronauts knew well the dangers of their mission, from the powerful forces of the rocket launch to the uncertainties of traveling and landing on the moon. Even without life insurance, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins were determined to go forward with their mission. In the early days of NASA, they didn't provide insurance for their employees, and private insurance was far too expensive for the astronauts, costing many times more than their salaries. To prepare for the worst, the astronauts took a different approach to secure their families' futures. Before their historic flight, they signed hundreds of autographs while in quarantine before launch. These autographs, often called insurance covers, were given to their loved ones as a form of financial safety. This idea came from the fact that they had become celebrities after being announced as Apollo 11 astronauts. These signed items were stamped with the date of the launch and could be sold if the astronauts faced a tragic fate. Fortunately, these autographs were never needed for that purpose. After Apollo 11, 10 more astronauts walked on the moon until 1972. Number 11. Unlikely origins, the spacesuits from a lingerie company. The Apollo 11 spacesuits have a truly intriguing story of creativity and unexpected teamwork. While the entire Apollo 11 mission is celebrated as a triumph of engineering, many people are surprised to learn that the spacesuits were a unique case. They were incredibly well designed, but the actual engineering was handled differently. Interestingly, a lingerie company played a key role in designing these suits. For example, Neil Armstrong's custom-made spacesuit, model A7L with serial number 056, cost around $100,000 at the time, which is about $670,000 today. No expense was spared in ensuring the suit could handle the extreme temperatures on the moon, from a scorching 240 degrees Fahrenheit in direct sunlight to a freezing 280 degrees Fahrenheit in the shadows. The suit also had to protect astronauts from dangerous solar ultraviolet radiation, and even a small mistake in stitching could make the suit unusable. The challenge was not just in making a suit that could endure such harsh conditions, but also in ensuring it was flexible enough for the astronauts to move comfortably. The International Latex Corporation from Dover, Delaware, was given the task of creating the suits. But it was Playtex, a company known for making bras and girdles that found the secret to combining flexibility with durability. This surprising partnership between a lingerie company and NASA's suit designers led to a suit that allowed astronauts to move freely while staying well protected. Thus, Playtex played a crucial role in the success of the Apollo 11 mission. Number 10. The intense training of the Apollo 11 astronauts. Potential astronauts like Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins had to undergo very tough physical and mental tests to be considered for space travel. They needed to be between 25 and 35 years old, shorter than 5 feet 11 inches, hold a degree in engineering or physical science, and have at least 2,000 flying hours, including experience as a test pilot. Their training was demanding and diverse. They faced intense G-force training to simulate the forces of launch and re-entry, learned how to move in zero gravity, and even practiced planting the flag on the moon. To mimic the moon's lower gravity, astronauts were suspended sideways and had to walk along a wall. Neil Armstrong later mentioned that walking on the moon was easier than the training he had undergone. For their return to Earth, astronauts were trained to splash down in the sea. They spent a lot of time practicing how to exit their spacecraft in swimming pools or the Gulf of Mexico. They also learned survival skills for jungles and deserts, just in case they landed off course. The spacecraft was equipped with a pressurized system and an oxygen supply for normal breathing. On the moon, astronauts wore a portable life support system, PLSS, a large box on their backs that provided oxygen and removed exhaled carbon dioxide. The Apollo 11 crew had a variety of meals, though they generally found them unappetizing and difficult to prepare. They had about 70 freeze-dried dishes and various drinks, all requiring water to rehydrate. They used a probe to add water through a valve in the food pouch. Hot and cold water was available in the command module, but it stayed at room temperature in the lunar module. After rehydrating, the food was kneaded and squeezed into their mouths or eaten with a spoon. Meals were packed in color-coded plastic bags and labeled with the date and time. After eating, germicide pills were placed in the empty food bags to stop fermentation, and the waste was stored in a disposal compartment. Number 9. The Saturn V rocket, a near disaster. The Saturn V rocket was a huge milestone in American space exploration and was crucial to the success of the Apollo 11 mission. However, its incredible power also came with serious risks, as shown by a close call in 1968. NASA originally designed the Saturn V to lift the Apollo spacecraft into space and head to the moon. Despite its impressive capabilities, safety concerns were raised after a troubling event during the Apollo 6 test flight in 1968. During this test, the Saturn V faced several problems. One major issue was the failure of the second stage's engines to restart for the second burn. This problem caused the rocket to end up in a lower orbit than planned, which could have impacted the mission's success. Engineers were worried that the rocket might explode, creating a massive fireball 1,400 feet wide and reaching temperatures of up to 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Despite these challenges, the ground crew took quick action to manage the risks. Thankfully, the Saturn V made it through the test, and although it didn't meet all of its goals, the team was able to gather important data. This information led to improvements in future Apollo missions, including the successful landing on the moon in 1969. Today, the Saturn V is a symbol of human creativity and determination, having achieved its major goals without any loss of life or major accidents. Number 8. Neil Armstrong's perfect landing. Neil Armstrong was an exceptional pilot, and after liftoff, the success of the mission largely depended on his skills. Before joining the Apollo 11 mission, Armstrong had experience as a naval aviator, engineer, and test pilot, earning praise for his flying abilities. Even Buzz Aldrin, his fellow astronaut, considered him the best pilot he had ever met. NASA had tried to determine the exact landing spot for the lunar module, the Eagle, in the Sea of Tranquility, a flat area on the moon. However, when they arrived, they discovered a large crater at the planned landing site. Armstrong took control of the landing manually to find a safer place. He expertly guided the Eagle to a smooth touchdown, so smooth that the landing gear didn't collapse as expected. The landing legs were designed to crumple and absorb the impact, but Armstrong's precision meant the gear stayed intact. As a result, the astronauts had to jump down from a higher altitude than planned. Although the soft landing was not an issue, the unexpected spot cost them some of their fuel. Luckily, Armstrong was confident they had enough fuel to safely land and return. Number 7. The smell of the moon. If we're going to return to the moon, the goal should be to stay on its surface for longer periods to conduct more in-depth research. However, there's a significant challenge. The moon's surface isn't as safe as it might appear. In 2015, NASA set an ambitious goal to improve the durability of spacesuits so they could handle 100 extravehicular activities, EVAs, which amounts to about 800 hours on the moon's surface. Achieving this would greatly extend the time astronauts can spend there compared to the Apollo missions, which is crucial for building a long-term base on the moon. This dust isn't like the dirt on Earth. It's made of fine particles and sharp glass-like shards. It can be harmful to spacesuits and equipment because it sticks to surfaces and causes damage due to its dry and abrasive nature. Additionally, when lunar dust is exposed to sunlight, it becomes electrically charged, which makes it even harder to manage. Dust particles stick to everything, creating tough conditions for astronauts. To tackle this problem, NASA launched the Breakthrough Innovative and Game-Changing Idea Challenge in 2021. This competition led to new solutions, such as using electrically charged brushes powered by UV light, conductive fibers, and fabrics inspired by insects. One promising idea is to add an electrodynamic dust shield system to spacesuits. Carbon nanotubes, known for their high electrical conductivity and strength, are being considered for creating flexible electrodes. These electrodes can generate electrical currents to push away dust. Though this effort is still ongoing, NASA's work shows its dedication to overcoming obstacles and advancing lunar exploration. By solving the lunar dust issue, NASA hopes to establish a long-lasting human presence on the moon. Number 6. Buzz Aldrin's secret communion. Before the mission, although Buzz Aldrin wasn't widely known for being religious, he had quietly prepared for a special moment when he reached the moon. As a Christian, he saw the moon landing as a chance to show his faith in a very personal way. Aldrin had arranged with his pastor to take communion on the lunar surface, a strong act of worship set against the backdrop of space. This private ceremony, which happened shortly after the famous moonwalk, remains a lesser-known and often overlooked event in space exploration history. Aldrin wanted to keep this ceremony secret due to NASA's worries about possible public backlash and controversy. Although he wasn't the first person to pray in space, he became the first to take part in a Christian sacrament on the moon. During the ceremony, Aldrin took sacred bread and wine, which had been blessed on Earth. He did this while preparing to step out of the spacecraft as the second person to walk on the moon. Aldrin asked for a moment of silence and invited his fellow astronaut, Neil Armstrong, to join him. Armstrong respectfully chose not to participate and quietly watched. NASA kept this event hidden, recalling the controversy from the Apollo 8 mission when astronauts read from the Bible and faced a lawsuit. Over time, Aldrin's actions have been respected and appreciated. No matter our beliefs or backgrounds, we all share the same Earth, look up at the same moon, and enjoy the same sun. Moments like these highlight the common bonds that unite us as human beings. Number 5. The misquoted iconic line. Neil Armstrong's famous words when he first stepped onto the moon have become legendary, but there might have been a small error in what we remember him saying. The well-known quote, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," is etched in our memories, but Armstrong later said he said, "That's one small step for a man." A problem with the audio transmission made the A in a man hard to hear, leading to the misquote. This small difference stirred up a lot of debate, with Armstrong himself admitting the issue in 2006. Peter Sean Ford, a computer programmer, later examined the recording and found a brief unclear sound between "for" and "man," suggesting that Armstrong did say "a man" as he intended. Although whether Armstrong said "a man" or not might seem minor, those words were spoken at a pivotal moment in history, making them highly significant. The discovery that Armstrong's line might have been correct all along brings some resolution to this long-standing debate. Number 4. Almost stranded. The Apollo 11 close call. The Apollo 11 mission faced many challenges that almost turned into disasters. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, the astronauts on the mission, ran into a major problem after their historic moonwalk. As they were getting ready to return to the command module, they found out that an important switch, called the circuit breaker for the engine arm, was broken. This switch was crucial for starting the engine that would lift their lunar module back into orbit. Without it, they couldn't leave the moon's surface. Aldrin used a felt-tip pen to push the broken switch into the closed position, finding a temporary fix to activate the engine arm circuit breaker. This quick solution ensured that the engine arm was ready to fire when needed. Despite this success, their challenges were far from over. After a journey lasting 195 hours, 18 minutes, and 35 seconds, Apollo 11 landed in the Pacific Ocean for recovery. However, bad weather caused the spacecraft to land 13 miles farther from the recovery ship, USS Hornet, than planned. Number 3. PostMission Quarantine. After returning to Earth, the astronauts had to go through quarantine. Although the most challenging parts of their mission were over, they couldn't see their families just yet. They had to stay in quarantine to make sure they weren't carrying any harmful bacteria or unknown substances from the moon, even though many people thought it was unlikely they had encountered such life. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins spent 21 days in quarantine after their historic moon mission. NASA wanted to be extra cautious, just in case the astronauts had picked up any dangerous microbes. Neil Armstrong even celebrated his birthday during this period. Despite being under quarantine, NASA organized a special birthday party for him, with a cake made by the team at what is now Johnson Space Center. While the astronauts were quarantined, doctors carefully monitored their health, and experts analyzed all the lunar samples they had brought back. After those long 21 days, they were finally allowed to go home. Fortunately, no moon-related germs seemed to have come back with them. We weren't ready for an outbreak of moon sickness. Number 2. The permanent marks left on the moon. Humans have always had a natural urge to mark the places we visit. Just like travelers who leave signs or keep souvenirs to remember their trips, astronauts do the same when they go into space. Many people think that Apollo 11 only left the American flag on the moon, but there's more to the story. For example, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin's footprints are still on the moon. Since there's no weather to erode them, those marks could remain for a very long time, perhaps even as long as the moon itself. Besides the footprints, they also left part of their landing module behind. One of its legs had a plaque that read, "Here, men from the planet Earth first set foot on the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." It's like they wanted to make sure that if any aliens found it, they'd know we came in peace. The astronauts also left behind a mix of tools and trash. To make their spacecraft lighter for the return trip, they had to get rid of some of their gear. This included hammers, scoops, and even human waste. 96 bags of it. Number 1. Expectations of disaster. Back in the 1960s, people thought reaching the moon was a disaster waiting to happen. The technology we have today, like iPads and tablets, didn't exist back then. So many people believed the mission was doomed from the start. After all, landing on the moon seemed like such an extraordinary achievement that it almost seemed impossible. Some activists argued that spending money on the mission was a waste, and that the funds could be better used elsewhere. Some people kept their doubts to themselves, but still thought the mission was destined to fail. Even President Richard Nixon was prepared for the worst. Before the Apollo 11 mission even began, his speechwriter, William Safire, drafted a speech for him to deliver in case the mission ended in disaster. The speech would have talked about the dangers of space travel and perhaps honored astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. Many people anxiously watched as Apollo 11 prepared to launch, fearing that the astronauts might never return. Luckily, this speech was never needed. What are your thoughts on the shocking secrets of why NASA never returned to the moon? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section.